Hello, I'm Barry Lamb. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Vassar College, and my talk today is called Why Punish? The talk is about punishment in interpersonal life and in the criminal justice system, and the relationship between the two. And ultimately, we're going to ask the question whether we're justified in punishing people in interpersonal life and in the criminal justice system. The first thing we have to get clear about is what counts as punishment and what is it? What counts as punishment for our purposes today is going to be divided into the kind of punishment that we engage in our interpersonal life with our friends, with strangers, with family, right? I'm going to call that interpersonal punishment. Some examples of that might include things like social shunning. I mean, ignoring someone or actively putting them down on social media, in real life, right? Placing them outside of the social group. Moral downranking. Moral downranking is when you treat an individual as having a sort of lesser moral status than you otherwise would. And of course, other forms of penalty, like taking something away from a child, right? We can think of that as a kind of punishment interpersonally. State punishment, the kind that's dished out by the criminal justice system, really only has two forms, right? We have prisons and jails, right? That's the official state form of punishment. And then we have these other forms of punishment that are actually punishments if you think hard about it, but we don't call them that. And these are things that are the collateral consequences that we give to people who were formerly incarcerated or have a criminal record. Things like we don't give them student aid or federal housing assistance or welfare, right? A kind of interpersonal punishment that we give to people who have a criminal record is something like not hiring them for your job. That could be considered a kind of punishment. For instance, when you have two individuals of the same quality, both of whom you think can do the job just as well, but one has a criminal record and the other one doesn't, you might think that it's a kind of punishment to hire the person without the criminal record. You're treating the person with the criminal record as having a kind of diminished moral status. Maybe they deserve the job less or something to that effect. It's a penalty. Okay, so these are some examples of punishment. And in philosophy, having examples is not enough to have a definition. We'd like to have a definition to work with. So the definition that I'm going to propose for today's purposes is that a punishment is the purposeful infliction of harm on an individual as a response to their wrongdoing, right? And it serves as a way of condemning their wrongdoing. So there's a lot of things that, for instance, the state does and that we individuals do to each other that are burdens and harms that we impose on people that aren't punishments of this kind. So one example, forced vaccinations in order to get herd immunity, right? Quarantining individuals, placing children in timeout, taxing people, right? Or actually taking them out of their home so you can build a highway or an airport. Building codes, right? These are things that people think of as very burdensome and maybe even harmful to them financially, maybe even personally. But they're not imposed for the purpose of condemning people for having done wrong, right? Okay. I want to make clear that something can be both a punishment and a kind of paternalistic response to people's wrongdoing, right? So forcing a child to practice penmanship, right? By making them write 100 times, I will not do that again. That's a punishment, but it might also be something that you think helps them, right? So things that are done solely for punishment purposes are things that you think people deserve. It's a harm to them. It condemns their wrongdoing. And you're willing to impose it on them even when you think that it doesn't help them in any way. And a lot of times, the things that we do in the criminal justice system are just like that, right? So to this day, we know that placing people in jail right, before they're actually convicted, just to hold them, not giving them bail or letting them free for longer than 10 days actually has a very detrimental effect on individuals. Holding people in prisons for a long term, right, for something like drug offenses might actually not help them in the long term. Sometimes there's a lot of evidence that it makes them more likely to commit crimes later, much more miserable. And yet, a lot of the people who think that that's a justified response to their wrongdoing say something like, well, they deserve it. That's the right amount of time that you should place them in prison because that's what we want to do to condemn that kind of wrongdoing. That would be strictly punishment. Okay. So, the question before us today is what justifies punishment, both interpersonally and at the level of the state? What justifies you punishing someone else for having wronged you in everyday life? Things that don't even enter into the criminal justice system. For instance, someone who's broken a promise to you, someone who's cheated on you, someone who borrowed money and never repaid you. Right? What justifies you punishing them? And at the level of the state, what justifies the criminal justice system that's punitive insofar it is punitive? Long prison terms, things like that. The answer that philosophers have given to both is that we human beings, unlike many things in nature, are morally responsible for our actions. You can blame people in a way that you can't blame a dog or a horse or a natural disaster. So moral responsibility is something that we very closely, uniquely tie to human interactions and human behaviors. So what is it? What is moral responsibility? Well, over the course of the 20th century, moral responsibility, philosophers think, is very closely tied to certain kinds of emotions that humans have and that humans use in everyday life. Right? And moral responsibility isn't just about blaming people for wrongdoing. It's about praising people for doing good things, right? We call them praiseworthy things. The philosopher P.F. Strawson pointed out that deserving blame and deserving praise for human beings in particular, being at fault, being culpable, all of the surrounding concepts that we use to hold each other responsible, punish individuals, are related to three emotions in particular. The emotions of guilt, indignation, and resentment. Strawson called these the reactive emotions. Why are they reactive? Because they are emotions that we have in reaction to the acts that other human beings commit to us. When someone does you wrong, breaks a promise, cheats, takes money from you, the reaction that you have to them is something like indignation or resentment or something to that effect. When you do something yourself that you consider wrong and you hold yourself responsible for it, holding yourself responsible for it is very close to feeling guilty about your own actions. Now, one way to connect these emotional reactions and the issue of moral responsibility in the way that Strawson did and in a way that philosophers have since concluded is the right way to connect them, is that being responsible, being morally blameworthy or praiseworthy, being morally blameworthy, let's focus on that particular case, is for guilt to be an appropriate reaction, for indignation to be an appropriate reaction, and for resentment to be an appropriate reaction. That's what it means to hold somebody responsible for something. When you feel guilt, and you should feel guilty, it's the right thing to feel. That judgment is the same thing as the judgment that you're morally responsible, some people say. And some people say it's not the same thing as being morally responsible, but it gives a very good guide that you're morally responsible, that you're to blame for an action. You're morally responsible for your actions when the emotions of guilt are appropriate, when the emotions of indignation and resentment that others feel towards you are the right emotions to have, When those are the right emotions to have, you are to blame, morally speaking, for your actions. The connection between that and the criminal justice system is given by a view of retributive justice, the theory of retributive justice. And that theory states that what criminal justice is the extension of that to society at large. The theory of interpersonal moral responsibility just applied to the state. The theory of retributive justice says when you are morally responsible in the interpersonal sense, guilt is the right emotion for you to have. Resentment is the right emotion for someone else to have towards you for something you did. Then that's when the state should also hold you blameworthy. There's one more step to take as to why punish, which is when you're morally responsible for an action interpersonally, it's a very short step away to say that it's appropriate for you to punish yourself and others to punish you. Why is that? Well, what is guilt and what is resentment and indignation but just an emotional form of punishment? Focus on guilt for a second. Guilt, you might think, is just an individual punishing themselves emotionally for the things that they've done in order to condemn themselves. Our definition of punishment. For the theory of retributive justice, whenever that's true interpersonally, they think that's what the state should be doing, what the legal system should be doing to you. Whenever it's appropriate, right, the right emotion to have for you to feel guilty, then it's the right thing for the state to do, to punish you, to censure you, to inflict some kind of harm on you in response to your wrongdoing, as the society's way of ensuring that you are condemned. The retributivist, the advocate of retributive justice, believes that there are moral constraints on what the state can do to you in terms of punishment. The primary moral constraint is the principle of proportionality. The punishment must fit the crime. This is something that we've heard a lot of. Too little punishment for a particular crime would be unjust, but too much of it would be unjust also. So you might ask the question, how does a retributivist determine what kind of punishment fits the crime? This is a very difficult task. Every advocate of retributive justice is going to tell you that it's a very difficult thing to do, to determine how much punishment and what kind of punishment goes with theft versus robbery and so forth. Broadly speaking, the retributivist says that there are two types of proportionality. The first is called relative proportionality. And this is the notion that when we try to figure out what punishment fits the crime, we should rank the crimes from worst to least bad, something to that effect. And once we have that ranking, for instance, murder is much worse than assault, so it ranks higher. Assault is worse than robbery, so we rank assault higher than robbery. Robbery worse than theft. And so once you have a ranking, then you have to make sure that whatever punishment you dish out for murder must be harsher than the punishment you dish out for assault. Assault must be harsher than robbery, and so forth. That's called relative or ordinal proportionality. But that notion of proportionality doesn't tell you what punishment to assign, only how much relative to each other, right? How much should a murder be punished, as opposed to how much should an assault? We know that assault should be less than murder, but how much should be assault? A year? 2 years? In that case, murder has to be greater than 2. The assignment of specific punishments to crimes is called cardinal proportionality or absolute proportionality. And for The advocate of retributive justice, the best example of this is, for instance, murder. The advocate of an eye for an eye, or lex talionis, would say, murder requires the state to take the life of the murderer. And then if you think that's true, then you have a relative ranking of the other crimes that you get from ordinal proportionality. Then you just kind of subtract from the state taking the life of others to generate whatever punishments that you think, all the way down to the least worst crime, say speeding on the highway. These are all questions that the advocate of retributive justice needs to answer. And it opens them up to criticisms. So, critics of retributive justice, people who argue that the state should not be in the business of punishment, argue on many different grounds. One ground is that judgments of proportionality are just impossible, right? You cannot have a consistent, coherent, and system that makes sense where you say something like assault should be given 5 months versus 5 years. You're never going to get agreement on that. So even if you have a ranking that a lot of people can agree to, people are not going to agree about whether some prison time or no prison time is appropriate for, say, delivering mail without a license or something like that. Okay? So skeptics about proportionality say that the state is in no position to make the right judgments about what punishments go with what crimes. And they have a point if you look at the history of this kind of thing, that there are all kinds of disastrous attempts at assigning particular punishments to crimes. Things that have led to the United States being the country that has 25% of the world's prison population, even though it has only 4% of the world's population. Other critics of retributive justice say things like, the state should not be involved in the business of dishing out desserts or what people deserve or punishments. The state should only be in the business of protecting and preventing crimes, protecting people from them. And that's a very different task than dishing out what people deserve. So for instance, if you think that someone deserves to be in jail for 10 years for some crime, but that person actually poses no real threat to the general population, or at least not a threat that is worthy of 10 years of imprisonment. Most threats can be averted for far less than that. An advocate of retributive justice says they should be in jail for 10 years because that's what they deserve. An advocate of protection and prevention says you only impose on someone so much as is needed for the protection of the public and the prevention of further crime. Any more than that is unjust. So there's a difference between a state that's involved in protection and punishment, and the critic of retributive justice says the state should not be in the business of the punishment. Another criticism of retributive justice says that the state can lose its right to punish by being an illegitimate state. So for instance, if the state itself is involved in serious injustices, then it loses its moral standing to punish its citizens for crimes they commit. One version of this objection is that the state needs to make sure that it has given every citizen an opportunity to be a law-abiding citizen, to have a good life as a law-abiding citizen. And the state has an obligation to protect everyone from criminal activity. But when the state makes it so that some small proportion of the population needs crime in order to make a living, or is not protected by the state from crime so that they have to engage in crime to protect themselves, then the state has lost its legitimacy to punish those people for committing crimes. Finally, the most radical critique of retributive justice are people who think that human beings in general should not be in the business of punishment. They say that interpersonal punishment is already illegitimate. So extending it to the state is going to be illegitimate also. And these generally are people who are skeptics about moral responsibility. There are people who think that no one really is morally responsible for anything. Some of them argue that moral responsibility, holding each other accountable, rests on a fiction. They think things like human beings don't have free will or the freedom to change their actions because they're causally determined by genes and environment and other things like that. And so because nobody is morally responsible for anything, you can't hold people to blame. You can't make them feel guilty, and it's inappropriate to resent them or feel indignant toward them. Other skeptics argue that maybe some people are morally responsible and others aren't. They have an excuse. But no one really is in a position ever to know that, because whether you're morally responsible or not depends on certain things that are very hidden from human beings, like psychology or social circumstances, all of the factors that lead people to act the way they act. Nobody can really know whether or not someone truly is responsible for their actions or have an excuse. And finally, one last critique about punishment in general are people who believe that the blaming emotions, guilt, resentment, indignation, are always inappropriate and fruitless. There's always going to be a morally enlightened response to wrongdoers that doesn't make use of beating yourself up inside or resenting other people. And this kind of view has a long tradition in the religious traditions of this world, actually. You see it in Buddhism, you see it in a lot of non-Western religions. And if you look in the Christian tradition and some of the Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions, you're going to find a thread of it there also. So I want to conclude the talk by saying this question, why punish, is a philosophical question with dramatic consequences for the real world. Right? If people who are revisionist about punishment are correct, then we can't have a legal system that employs punishment. We can only have a legal system that prevents and protects us. But insofar as anything harsher than that is something that people think criminals deserve, people are wrong.